any of these issues beyond the webinar today. But we're going to be talking about democracy and public opinion in the EU. I have a few introductory slides that Polly and Lois will be familiar with because I just presented them, and I'm not going to go into as great a detail with these so that we have more time to talk about the issue itself. But European integration is a term that we oftentimes use in conjunction with EU, the European Union. It's meant to imply the sort of processes that have led to the creation of the EU, or have sort of built up the EU over time. It's a term that I think of as being very legal in nature, meaning what the EU is in essence is taking different national laws about a particular policy or area, say agriculture or farming. And the example I love to give, I don't know why it's very strange, are carrots. So we'll say that France legislates that carrots can only be grown a certain height, and Germany has it at a different height. Integration is that process by which the EU comes up with one European law about how big carrots can be when they're being produced. So it's the way of coming up with this single legal framework that's the basis for the European economy. It started back in the early 1950s and has really progressed through a number of treaties. And again, I'm very happy to share these slides with you, but I'm not going to take the time to go through them now so that we can talk a little bit more about the subject of the presentation. But in essence, what has happened is that over the last 60 years, the policy jurisdictions, meaning the number of policy areas that the EU has authority to make laws in, has gradually increased. The powers of the EU institutions, that's those political bodies that are tasked with sort of making these laws and implementing these laws, their powers have increased over time. And that's largely because the member states, Germany and France and Great Britain, have continued to come back to the table and negotiated new treaties that have expanded those powers and have expanded the legal basis. The EU institutions, real quick, are the European Commission, which is the executive of the EU that authors proposals for new EU laws and implements them. The Parliament and the Council of Ministers, which are tasked with approving the Commission's laws. The Council represents the member states themselves, and so it makes sure that the interests of the individual state governments are taken into account. The Parliament is intended to represent the people, which is something we're going to talk a little bit about today, whether it in fact does that. But they're tasked with approving any proposals that have been written by the Commission. The Court of Justice is like the Supreme Court of the European Union. It's tasked with sort of hearing cases about what the proper judicial basis of the EU's authority is. In other words, if the Commission starts to write proposals that are beyond what the treaties have allowed it, then there's probably going to be a case in front of the Court of Justice where the Court of Justice has to consider if there's a legal basis for the said proposal. And then there's the European Council, which are the heads of state of the different EU countries who come together and sort of establish the general direction of the EU. Okay, so this is then the sort of introduction to democracy in the European Union, or what is oftentimes called the democracy deficit. The EU is critiqued by scholars and by the media and by individuals from the member states and even some individuals from the EU institutions themselves for being insufficiently democratic. And it's a discussion that really dates back to 1992. That's when the Treaty of the European Union was passed. That's when the name the European Union was actually created. And the reason why that was so important was, on one hand, it was a very significant extension of the EU's power. So that with the Treaty of the European Union, the EU began to address foreign and security policy, which it hadn't previously had much of a mandate to address. That's when justice and home affairs came under its remit. So that's when the EU was empowered to start to address immigration and asylum seeking standards, both of which are very important policies to the public. And it's when the euro was first conceived. That's when they said, okay, we're going to create this common European currency. So it was a significant expansion of the EU's powers that drew a lot of attention. Prior to this point, the sort of theoretical framework was that the EU's legitimacy was based on what they call a permissive consensus. And the permissive consensus is this idea that mostly the public is giving consent to elites to make decisions within the EU by not really knowing what's going on. You know, the idea is that the public as a whole, not even individuals, are saying, we don't really get or understand or care about what's going on at the European level. We're just going to trust you as our elected or appointed leaders to do what's best in our interests. I'm not quite sure that was actually what was going on, but that's what is thought of as being the legitimate basis of decision making with the EU up until 1992. But then what happens in 92 is we have this new treaty of the European Union. The media starts talking about it more than they ever have before. And there are an awful lot of concerns that are raised in some of the member states. And they actually ended up holding a public referendum on the treaty in Denmark. It was the first really well-known referendum. There had been a couple prior in Ireland, but none that had drawn much attention or had generated much interest from the public. So there's this Danish referendum, and the Danish public rejects the Treaty of Maastricht. And so the elected decision makers had to go back and sort of renegotiate it a little and put in some language that was more acceptable to the Danish leaders and to the Danish public. But the result of this was that people that study the EU and people within the EU itself sort of stood up and said, well, now wait a second, there's this whole public out here, and it's not clear that they really support what we're doing at this level. And that's when there started to be a lot more attention paid to the entire idea of that the EU should be something that is democratic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the deficit argument itself, because I think of the democracy deficit as entailing three specific critiques of the European Union. So I'm going to talk about those, and then talk a little bit about actual public opinion and what we know the public thinks about the EU based on the survey data that we have available. But the first aspect of the democracy deficit, and again, this is a sort of scholarly argument, a broader critique that's developed since 1992 about the EU and the ways in which it's not democratically efficient. The first concerns accountability, which I define here from a common textbook on the EU by a scholar named Michel Cini. It's the requirement that representatives should answer to the represented on how they have performed their duties and powers. It's a very sort of broad definition of it. The one definition that I actually prefer and that I think is more relevant to the deficit argument itself is from Gustavsson in 2000, and that's that it should be possible to replace the holders of a political office through general elections, and by doing so to achieve an alternative set of policies. So you may have elections in a country, but unless those elections enable you as voters to actually change the course of decision making, then you haven't really achieved political accountability. And the best way to think about this is if you have a dictator, say, in a country, and that individual wants to appear as if they support democracy and that their country is democratic, they may hold elections, not for their position, but for a parliament that doesn't really have any power within their country. So, they hold open elections for the public to elect representatives. They don't give that legislative body any sort of authority, but then they point at the elections and say, hey, look, we're democratic. Well, obviously they're not, because no matter how many people participate in those elections, the elections don't ultimately lead to any changes in how decisions are made or the types of decisions that are being made. So it's not really them meeting this idea that democratic accountability is in place, that you can hold those who are making decisions responsible for the results of their decisions. The problem within the EU, then, is that the institutions for making EU policies aren't the ones that are necessarily based on the voters or other expressions of voter preferences. Or in other words, Europeans cannot necessarily achieve an alternative set of policies at the European level by going out and participating in elections. They don't have a direct mechanism to hold the main decision makers within the EU accountable for their decisions. And this critique kind of encompasses each of the EU institutions. So we look at the Commission, and that's comprised of lifelong bureaucrats and political appointees. No one that's in the Commission has really been elected to that position. And in fact, some of the individuals who are trying to reform the EU, who are putting out constantly proposals for institutional reforms that can make it more democratic, call for the president of the Commission to be elected, much like the president of the United States is in a European-wide election. And there's there's evidence that there's actually support for this that's gathering, because the president of the commission is a very important individual. But as of right now, the commission, which is the executive, it's the body that's actually writing the proposals and that's tasked with implementing those proposals, does not have any sort of democratic mandate itself. The Council of Ministers is interesting. That's the legislative body that has to approve the commission's proposals. And it's made up of representatives from the member states. Now, many of those representatives are actually elected. So, for instance, the agricultural minister from Germany is first elected in the German election to be a representative within the German parliament, within the Bundestag. And once they're there, then they're invited to join maybe the German government and occupy the seat of agricultural minister for Germany. And then in that position, they're representing Germany in the Agricultural Council of the EU. So you can see that there actually is an electoral mandate. But as the critique of the council goes, those individuals that are in the council weren't actually elected at the EU level. They weren't elected to represent the public within European affairs, right? The agricultural minister in Germany, for instance, was elected from a single district. So not the entire country, just their specific district and their specific constituency. And to the extent that you can say they have an electoral mandate, that's to be an elected official within Germany, not at the European level. So as the argument goes, the council is actually too far removed from the elections that are the basis for the individuals that are making the council up. If the council ministers were elected separately within European elections, then they'd have that direct democratic mandate. Now, this, I think, is an argument that is certainly susceptible to critique itself. I mean, you know, when you elect a representative, you elect them to represent you and your country or your country's interests at multiple levels, or some would argue that at minimum. So this distinction that's being made between the national and European level isn't necessarily a strong one, but certainly this is an argument that some have made. The European Central Bank, which is the guardian of the euro currency, and the body tasked with establishing European monetary policy and interest rates within the EU, is considered, I think, by most to be one of, if not the most autonomous central banks in the world. It has almost no political basis for its power. So its leaders are appointed. They're appointed for a set term. There's no possibility for reappointment. So once they're in there, I think they can serve 2 terms, but there's nothing they can or need or should do in order to please anyone so that they can keep their office. Because by law, they can only keep their office for so long. And the idea is that this is designed to empower them or allow them to create the best monetary policies, and policies that aren't necessarily subject to immediate political pressures. That may be, and in fact I think most would argue that is a good thing from the perspective of macroeconomic policy. From the perspective of democratic accountability, which is that we should be able to hold our main decision makers accountable for their decisions, then that's probably a bad thing, right? Because these are important decision makers and they're not subject to any sort of accountability from the public. The Court of Justice, similarly, the public has no say in appointment of judges there, isn't really even conscious, actually, of appointment of judges. It's the member states who each get to nominate and appoint one of 27 judges that sits on the court. And the court, again, has been a very important body in terms of deciding when the EU institutions have jurisdiction, and in many ways sort of pushing the boundaries of European integration. So the court has tended to side with the Commission and has preferred interpretations that give the Commission more power historically. And you know, as conventional wisdom goes, the public probably wouldn't agree with that, and yet they don't really have any mechanism or any say for holding those justices accountable. And then I want to talk really briefly about the European Parliament, because the Parliament was created and continued to be the voice of the public. This is really where democratic legitimacy should come from in the EU. This is where the accountability is created. As the deficit critics go, the Parliament is not powerful enough to really serve as a mechanism of accountability. So it comes back to this idea that even if you have elections, those elections have to matter. You have to be able to change the course of decision-making for those elections to really allow for some sense of accountability. Now, the European Parliament had almost no decision-making power until 1992. So up until, you know, roughly 20 years ago, you couldn't argue that it was in any way a mechanism of accountability, because whoever you voted for in the European Parliament, that had no effect on any sort of decision that was being made within the EU. What we've seen since 1992, though, and largely in response to this deficit critique, is an expansion of the Parliament's powers, so that today it must sign off on any proposal for it to become a law. Now, that said, even though it is still it is a much more powerful body within the EU decision-making process, for many people, it still is not sufficient to sort of create a sense of democratic accountability, because first of all, it has no legislative initiative, right? So we think of our national parliaments. This really isn't the case, but we think of our national parliaments as being the ones that should write the laws. And within the EU, that power is entrusted to the Commission, which is again made up of appointed bureaucrats and officials. So there's no legislative initiative with the Parliament. The Parliament doesn't have the power to nominate an executive. So in most European parliaments, the leader, the Prime Minister or the President, is selected from the parliamentary body and by the members of Parliament. Not in all European countries, but in many of them. The Parliament has no such power. The most the Parliament can do is kind of sign off on whoever the member states themselves have nominated. But it doesn't actually get to select that individual. And then finally, and this is maybe the most damning critique of the Parliament, the elections aren't considered genuine instruments of a competition over EU policy. And what I mean by that is when there's a European parliamentary election, and there's maybe 2 or 3 candidates from different parties who are competing for a seat, let's say, if that's the elections are structured differently from country to country, but there are some that there are actually candidates who are competing against each other. They don't take positions on EU issues. They tend to address only national issues. They'll say, hey, what about that Gordon Brown guy? He's been doing a miserable job. We need to get rid of him. You know, so they attack the opposing party based on its performance at the national level. They talk about what's going on within the national government. Talk about what's hot at the national level. They don't ever address anything that's going on at the EU level. They don't talk about the sorts of things that they're actually going to have to decide if they're elected. So the public doesn't really have the opportunity to evaluate them based on what they would do within the EU itself. And this, again, is a much more nitty-gritty interpretation of how you get democratic accountability. But as the argument goes, this isn't providing accountability for the EU because the public doesn't have the opportunity to evaluate what elected representatives are doing at the EU. They just represent those, they evaluate those representatives as they stand on national issues. And so elections and the nature of European elections would have to change dramatically in order to create this sense of accountability. Okay, the second critique I wanted to talk about today is transparency, or the extent of openness within the EU institutions. Again, I'll turn to Cini for a very broad definition of what we mean by this. And then another scholar, Hoskins, who in a book on democracy in the EU, or really it's a book on the democracy deficit, gets more specific and argues that it's the extent of public knowledge about and access to EU procedures and processes. And transparency is in many ways important itself, right? Because the idea of an informed citizenry, individuals being able to follow what the government's doing, is associated with democratic governance in of itself. But it's obviously important too for accountability, right? Because if a system is accountable because we're able to punish decision makers who have made bad decisions and reward those who have made good ones, we have to know who's actually making the decisions and what decisions they've made. And if a system's not transparent, in other words, we don't have access to documents or meetings of different minutes where decisions are being made, we don't know which political actors involved in a particular decision or how much responsibility they have, then it becomes very difficult to sort of identify who to reward and who to blame. And accountability then becomes much more problematic. So transparency has an indirect effect on accountability in addition to sort of being important on its own. But the first part of Hoskins' definition is about accessibility, right? Meaning that if a system is democratic, then the public has to have access to documents. And certainly this is a norm that's enshrined within the United States. We have the Freedom of Information Act, right, whereby any citizen in America can request certain documents so long as they're not somehow tied to national security, and they have the right to receive those documents. That was an idea that was not necessarily part of the EU until the mid-1990s. The meetings of the Council of Ministers where the member states approved Commission proposals never happened in public. No one really knew where they happened at all. Now they're very good at saying they do. People weren't even sure really where these read minutes or see what the different deliberations were that went on in any sort of decision-making process. So it was very secretive, in other words. There was no legal provision for access to documents. They didn't have their own Freedom of Information Act, in other words. Now, that all has largely changed. This is one area where I think the European Union has made significant advances. And it really began with the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1996. But over the last 2 decades, over the course of multiple treaty reforms, they've made it a legal requirement for the Council and the Commission and the European Parliament to conduct most public business in public, in open meetings. Not everything, anything involving national security or national intelligence, obviously is apart from that and occurs in secret. But most other aspects of policymaking have to be in public. There has to be minutes taken at these meetings. Those minutes have to be published along with the votes of different member state representatives. They've introduced a treaty mandate, so there's now a legal basis by which any EU citizen, and an EU citizen is a citizen of any member state. So if you're a citizen of Germany or France, you are an EU citizen. Any EU citizen can request any documentation that they want, and they can do it in their native language. So there's a lot of investment in translation services now just to make sure that people are able to access and to understand documents about what the EU is doing. So there's been significant improvement here. The problem then that remains with transparency is that it's not clear that the public's able to actually understand what's going on within the EU. So even though they have access to documents and are able to sort of monitor what's going on in meetings, it can still be very difficult to figure out who's making the decision and what the basis of that decision is, because there are so many actors involved. I mean, the EU itself has these 3 main actors, the European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, and the Commission, but each of those has their sort of own sub-actors within it that are involved in the decision-making process. And then you have private groups that have an institutionalized role. You have the Social and Economic Committee, which is made up of representatives from private interest groups. And the treaties give that committee a legal basis to have a role in decision-making for some policy areas. You have member state representations themselves. And so there's just a large number of people involved in this. And even if you have access to the meetings, the minutes for a meeting of the Council of Ministers, it can still be very difficult to figure out who is actually responsible for the end outcome. Who should we blame for this particular agricultural law about carrots? In other words, if we don't like what's going on with it, do we blame our member state? If we do that, they're just going to say, well, it wasn't us, it was the EU. That happens quite often. The leader of a particular state, whether they do or don't support a particular proposal, will just point figures at the EU if it's unpopular. Do we blame the Commission? It's unclear what their role is. It's just difficult to sort of disentangle all this. And to make it even more difficult is there's different decision-making procedures within the EU. So sometimes when a decision is being made, it's by unanimity, and every country has to vote. Sometimes it's by majority voting. So if you want to understand why and how a decision was made, you really need to understand what that voting procedure is, and that voting procedure varies widely across different policy areas. So altogether, this just creates a very muddled situation where it's hard to sort of look at it and know what's going on. And that then serves as an impediment for transparency. Okay, the third critique is a lack of what we call demos then, or a democratic citizenry, an active and engaged citizenry who wants to be democratic, who wants to hold their political decision makers accountable. And again, turning to Cheney, we define a transnational demos as a composite citizen body, so bringing together the citizenries of each of the different member states, whose members collectively share an interest in the governance of the larger polity. And as the critics of EU democracy go, it's not democratic because there isn't really an EU citizenry. We don't have this active and engaged public who is interested in what's going on, who wants to follow what's going on, and then who wants to actually hold their decision makers accountable. So it's much more of a ground-up critique, but it's probably the most powerful critique of EU democracy that exists. I would note at the start that the EU institutions are cognizant of this, and they've made an effort to sort of try and create their own EU citizenry through using different symbols and traditions. We have an EU anthem, which is, actually I think they're ready to abandon it. And I believe someone may correct me on this because my memory is a little joggled. I think it's Beethoven's Seventh. Actually, that's the EU anthem. But it's meant to be a symbol that brings the European people together. We have the flag, right? So that every European can look at the flag and can feel a tinge in their heart. We have Europe Day, which is meant to celebrate everything the EU is. These are all symbols that are created to try and craft a connection between individuals and the European Union, so that they take more of an interest in it and that they want to be involved. Because the problem is that there isn't identification with EU history and there isn't identification with the EU institutions. We know from the public opinion data that individuals view Brussels as just too distant. And I'm not sure if that's true in this country, actually. Maybe it's something similar to, if anyone's from California, maybe Californians feel the same way, or people from the West Coast think that the federal government's too distant. I don't get the sense that that's the case in this country. But certainly a lot of people in Europe feel that Brussels is just too far away to really know what's going on, or to even try and make an effort to figure out what's going on. It just feels too far removed. There's no forums that are typically essential to developing an active, engaged, and informed citizenry. So how do we behave as informed citizens? We turn to the media. We turn to political discussion with our peers. We come together in common forums to try and discuss the issues of the day. Well, there is no widely used media outlet on EU politics. There are a couple that are trying to get off the ground that have more of a web presence than they do any sort of paper presence, but they simply aren't consumed by that many Europeans. They're consumed mostly by people who study the EU. The national and local media outlets, so television stations and newspapers in Europe, they'll devote some coverage to the EU, but it tends to be pretty minimal. And we know that through content analyses. We've gone through and we've watched hours of television coverage during European elections, for instance, or read through hundreds or thousands of news stories. And what we find is that there's very little time or space that's devoted to EU affairs. Because these outlets are concerned with local politics and they're concerned with national politics. And they're already devoting much of their time to that. So you don't get a lot of discussion of EU affairs through the media then. And then obviously you have a language barrier, or language barriers, because the idea of a transnational demos is that all of a sudden the French and the Germans and the Italians and the Dutch are going to come together, and although they're going to be citizens of their own national countries, they're also going to be European citizens, and they're going to sort of engage in these common interests. Well, that becomes very problematic if none of them can really understand each other. And of course, the response to this is that English is becoming the de facto second language of most Europeans. And it's certainly true that more and more Europeans speak English, and that is a language that is used to sort of bridge linguistic differences between countries. But if we want an active and engaged citizenry, that can't just be the most educated individuals within society. It has to be everyone that has the opportunity to do that. And certainly there are still large segments of each of these individual countries that don't speak English, and therefore really wouldn't even have the opportunity to communicate with EU citizens from other countries. On top of this, national loyalties have certainly been at times detrimental to the development of a stronger transnational culture. Some individuals, even within Europe, and actually an increasing number of individuals, perceive the EU as a threat to their national culture and to their way of life. And there are politicians across Europe that are trying to sort of accumulate power by appealing to these fears and playing these fears up. They're called Eurosceptic elites generally, but there are specific parties that are anti-EU that not only play on the supposed economic threat of the European Union, but also that it's working to sort of distill national differences and homogenize Europe until you're not going to have anything that makes any area distinctive anymore. And this strikes a chord with some people. We're pretty sure when we look at the data that the individuals that are more likely to be drawn to this are people who have suffered economically due to economic liberalization. So if you've lost your job because trade barriers have been removed and the company that employed you for 20 years was able to to relocate to Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania with almost no hindrance, you're already in sort of a bad position toward the EU, and you're more likely to find some appeal in these types of critiques. But at the same time, this is a growing problem for the EU, that these types of parties and politicians are getting power, and they're clearly striking a chord with a larger segment of the population. And again, at a more fundamental level, there's still a question of whether it's possible to be a devoted French or German citizen and a devoted European citizen at the same time. Some people argue that they're actually mutually reinforcing. But so long as you have some notion of democratic citizenship within your mind or within your heart already, that it's possible to sort of develop that loyalty at multiple levels. Others argue that the types of attachments that come about from this sort of nationalist sentiment are so strong that without any sort of xenophobia or any sort of cultural-based fears, they're going to preclude you from having more than one. You just can't be attached to two communities at the same time. And that's really an unresolved question on this topic. Another critique of EU democracy is that it actually hurts national democracy. So we're actually moving beyond the EU level. We're moving below the EU level. But deficit critics have started to expand out and say, well, not only is democracy not working correctly within the European Union, there's other negative consequences beyond that. And probably the most powerful critique is that it empowers national executives and it weakens the role of national parliaments. Because national executives, the prime ministers and presidents and their cabinet secretaries, they're the ones that are appointing representatives within the EU, or they're the ones that are going to the EU themselves and casting the vote on different proposals. And many of these proposals used to be decided within national parliaments, right? So agricultural policy, for instance, for a long time was the province of each national parliament. And when you elected your member of the German parliament or of the Belgian parliament or the Spanish parliament, that individual was representing you in their votes on proposed agricultural policies. Well, now that entire domain has been removed from the national level. It's not possible for these elected representatives to vote on it anymore. It's been taken up to the EU, away from them. And within the EU itself, the only people that have votes are the executives or their appointees. So the parliaments have a far weaker role than they did 30 or 40 years ago, and that is largely due to the EU. And at the same time, and I referenced this just a few minutes ago, it's given national executives a pretty powerful out when they're subject to political pressure. It's been known that a certain executive has pushed a proposal through the EU that they wanted done, that they knew was unpopular back in their home country with their constituency, but they felt for whatever reasons needed to be accomplished. So, you know, largely economic policies, but many policies that they didn't want to take credit for, but they thought needed to be passed. So they'll push it through the EU level, and then they'll go back to their country, and they'll face sort of a public outcry. You know, what's the EU doing? Why is it doing this? Why aren't you doing more? And then what the executive can do or their appointee can do is, well, we're just one of 27 here. You know, we've got to play ball or we can't get what we want done. And obviously it's relying on this lack of transparency within the EU. The executives, when they're trying to defer blame, are hoping that the public isn't going to be any the wiser about what they're actually doing at the European level. But we know it has been a common practice at times to sort of point the finger at other countries or at the EU itself, while they are in fact doing exactly what their constituents do not want them to do. I want to talk very briefly about some of the arguments that have been put forward in defense of the EU, because the democracy deficit isn't an argument that absolutely everyone buys into, and there are some people who actually think it's far too harsh, and that scholars are being somewhat unfair with the EU. And probably the most prominent is a scholar named Andrew Moravcik, who's written pretty extensively on this. And he argues first and foremost that he doesn't think that this is that big of a problem because, first of all, the EU doesn't pose the threat to national sovereignty that most individuals seem to think it does. In other words, Moravcik thinks that the EU is much more of just another international organization. And we empower our elected representatives to go to international organizations and represent us all the time without expecting any sort of extensive democratic controls, right? So Moravcik's saying, well, you know, the EU isn't all that different from what we've seen before. And there's no chance that at the end of the day, our national elected representatives aren't going to be able to do what they think is best. In other words, we haven't really seen any sort of removal of power that would prevent us from leaving the EU, for instance, if we actually wanted to. And related to that, Moravcsik argues that the best example is the EU doesn't really have extensive authority over the policy areas that matter to people. So policing, education, foreign and security policy, where there is some cooperation at the EU level, but only if each member state consents to it. Defense is still largely left in the national level. Most aspects of economic policy are either they're shared between the two, or the member states still retain control over that. And Moravcik's argument, I think this is becoming more and more outdated, actually, but his argument 10 years ago was that essentially the EU is not governing anything that has any real influence over the people. Okay, I've got a question about getting the PowerPoint, because I'm guessing maybe you need to leave, but there's my email address, and if you do have to go, you're more than welcome to write me at this address that's in the chat function, and I'll send the PowerPoint slides on. Related to that, Moravcsik says the EU institutions themselves they're never really going to get the power they need to pose any sort of threat to national sovereignty. That there are too many checks on EU power, there are too many institutions within the EU that are sort of fighting against each other, that the EU doesn't have the resources to expand its power base. Something we talked about in the last webinar is that the Commission is a very small bureaucracy, actually. It's around 23,000 people. So it's smaller than the city bureaucracies of Berlin or London or Paris. And that at the end of the day, the EU relies on the member states for enforcement because it has such a small bureaucracy. So there is no policing unit of any kind within the EU. There's no tax authority, really. There's just simply no enforcement mechanism that would give the EU any sort of powers by which it could threaten national sovereignty. Moravcsik argues that the EU also sufficiently provides for democracy, that the EU gives you a direct legislative mandate. And here we're coming back to the discussion I referred to earlier about the Council. Moravcsik argues the Council has a mandate as well, that regardless of what those individuals were elected for, the national ministers and secretaries that are being sent to the Council meetings were elected by the public. So there's an electoral mandate in both the Council and the Parliament. Thanks, Anna. And then finally, there's this sense that critics are applying a very idealized notion of democracy. And that many of these problems that we were just talking about exist at the national level. You know, we have large bureaucracies in the United States, for instance, that are made up of professional technocrats who have earned their jobs through merit-based competitive processes. They weren't elected, right? The people that are making a lot of the rules and regulations that we are subject to as Americans weren't elected to their position. That's how large representative government works. You elect some individuals, and those individuals then appoint, workers to put the government will into process. And Moravcsik argues that there are issues with transparency at the national level, that oftentimes individuals don't have access to necessary documents in many countries, and that even if they do, they don't understand it, much like these critics are contending is true of the EU. And obviously, having a demos, an active and engaged citizenry, is something that we all could doubt in this country or in others, based on turnout in elections alone. So, as Moravcsik goes, maybe there is something to some of these, but it's not unique to the EU. We need to start looking at how democracy works in general if we want to have this discussion. And in fact, talking about the EU kind of distracts from the larger issues, that these are just problems with modern representative democracy. Okay, let's see. Some have argued that democracy really isn't achievable or attainable at the EU level, and so to that extent, this discussion is moot. Robert Dahl, for instance, a prominent democratic theorist, has argued that when you get a territory that's that large and a population that's that large, it's just not possible to have the functioning democracy that's implied by the critique itself. And then obviously the EU lacks the tools necessary to create a demos. So they've tried with the flag and the anthem and Europe Day, but when it's all said and done, there is no history that unites people at the European level like there is in most national communities. Right? There just isn't the same conflict or background or social development that's occurred over centuries that brings a lot of people together. And so there's a question about whether the EU could really ever achieve this idea of a transnational demos. this all leads to the sort of concession by many that if we want to talk about democracy within the EU, we need to start to come up with new ideas and a sort of new model for how democracy might work. It's something I've tried to do actually in my own work, and I'm not sure I've been successful because it's a difficult question. You know, how does democracy evolve beyond how we what we know it is today? Technology clearly plays a role in that, but it's not clear where it's going or where it can go still, and it's certainly an ongoing discussion. Okay, I want to talk briefly, since we're running out of time, about actual public opinion in the EU. Because we have a wealth of data that tells us what individuals actually think about what's going on. And the EU regularly measures support, so whether people think that the EU is a good thing or a bad thing. And actually they measure many other concepts. It's a series of about 100 questions in general. And what are called Eurobarometer surveys. So there's a Eurobarometer survey twice a year, at least. Sometimes there's more than that. They tend to survey about 1,000 individuals from each member state. The smaller ones, sometimes it's 500. And like I said, they ask around about 100 questions in each one of these. But the one question that they've asked for about 30 years now, and is used as sort of the standard measure about what people think, is generally speaking, do you think that our country's membership of the EU is a good thing, a bad thing, or neither good nor bad? The question itself has come under some criticism, and I think there may be some better measures than this, but it has the advantage of having been around for some time. So we can look at what people thought 40 years ago with what they think now, and not have to worry about question wording being different or people's responses being based on different wording or different metrics. And this is a data trend that I put together from a merged survey file that we've constructed here at Indiana University that sort of charts where support for the EU has gone from 1990 through 2008. I think this is useful because the one thing I'd ask any of you to keep in mind, I'm sure you've read that support for the EU is declining dramatically, that more and more Europeans are coming around to this idea that it's a bad thing. And certainly Euroscepticism, this appeal to the negative features of the EU, that is becoming more popular. But Euroscepticism can be nuanced. Euroscepticism can be this idea that the EU is moving too fast, not just that the entire thing is bad and we need to get rid of all of it. And I think a lot of people who are drawn to Euroscepticism more and more don't necessarily disagree with the EU as a whole. They just don't like what's going on there now. But there's this picture that's painted that more and more people want to leave the EU. And I think that this chart makes clear that's not the case. So we can see the line at the top, which is kind of a green line, charts the number of people that say it's a good thing. And we can see that it has declined since 1990. But really over the last 15 years, or the 15 years up until 2008, it was pretty static. And it's roughly between 50 and 60% of respondents who still say, yeah, the EU is a good thing. Our country's membership in the EU is a good thing. Probably what's even more important to notice is the percentage of them saying it's a bad thing, because that's what everyone's focused on, right? That there's more and more people saying that the EU is just not worth it. And that hasn't changed all that much really since 1990. It peaked right around 2000, 2004, which is when the euro currency was introduced, and then when all the East European countries joined the EU. But for the most part, it stayed pretty consistent around 10%. So that's only 10% of respondents who are saying that their country's membership in the EU isn't good at all, that it's a bad thing. And I think some of the media accounts would lead you to believe that that's actually much higher than it is. This just gives you a sort of breakdown of how that differs between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, because again, there is sort of a conventional wisdom out there, which is that the EU is far more unpopular in the East than it is in the West. And even though these East European countries wanted to join the EU at the time, that they've quickly, or that the publics within those countries have quickly grown tired of it, and particularly some of the sacrifices they've had to make. And what we see here is that, with the exception of 2004, which is right when they joined, the differences aren't that great between West and East. So, it's of the order of probably between 3 and 7 or 8%, I'd say, on average in 2005, 2006, and 2007. And I'll tell you, I apologize that I don't have later years on this, but it's evened out even more since 2007. So that there aren't really that significant regional differences between the West and East any longer. There's been a lot of attention that's been devoted to explaining why individuals support the EU or why they oppose it. And again, this is a very interesting literature, but the thing I'd point out again is that it's only about 10% that oppose it, and the literature tends to overlook that. So when you're reading about why someone doesn't like the EU, you're really only talking about 1 in 10 Europeans at that point. But the predominant theory within the EU research is that whether you support the EU or not is based entirely on utilitarian concerns. Meaning, do you think that the EU positively affects your economic situation, your financial situation, or the economic situation of the country as a whole? And as this argument goes, then when they break it down, the theory is that individuals who are more likely to benefit from European integration, who have certain skills or knowledge or experience so that they can take advantage of new economic opportunities in other parts of Europe, they're the ones that are more likely to support the EU. There's an alternative body of literature then that argues that it's much more effective. And this is sort of the basis for that cultural argument I was talking about earlier, that people are framing the EU as a threat to the national way of life. And these scholars argue that the EU, rather than support being based on economic concerns, it's based much more on the perceived cultural or social effects of European integration. So that if for whatever reason you stumble across this belief that the EU does pose a threat to your national way of life, that's when the propensity to oppose European integration is going to increase dramatically. There is a flip side to it, which is that some people believe very strongly in unity, in coming together and working together, living in peaceful cooperation with one another, avoiding conflicts, and that those individuals are going to predispose to like the EU, not for economic terms, but because they see it as a mechanism for peaceful cooperation. And that side of it hasn't been explored as much. But the sort of thrust of this entire school is that it's not economic. It's much more about how you think of yourself and how you think of other people. There is a stream of theory that focuses on the quality of political institutions, so that in countries that have higher performing institutions, in other words, where the bureaucracy is much more responsive to public demands, where the legislature appears to be engaged with the citizenry and representing citizens' concerns, where the executive is accountable and responsible, these countries are where people start to focus on the deficit more. It's in those countries where people are concerned about democracy at the EU level, and it's in those countries where you start to see support decline. And there is some evidence for this, but again, it's pretty marginal, because at the end of the day, it's only that 10% that say that what elites think about the EU, about what elected representatives say. And this debate goes back and forth. There's evidence actually that the positions and the rhetoric of elites is following public opinion. And there's some evidence that public opinion is following elite cues. And so at the end of the day, it's probably much more dynamic, meaning that the two are influencing each other. And then there's a whole sort of separate body that looks at Euroscepticism. And there's different definitions of Euroscepticism. As I said, there's this idea of hard Euroscepticism, which is people think the EU itself is bad and their country needs to leave it. And then there's a concept of soft Euroscepticism, which is it's not quite that stark. They don't want their country to leave the EU. They just think that the whole thing needs to slow down a little. It's maybe moving too fast in certain areas, and that it sort of needs a breather at this point in time. And as I've said over the course of the webinar, different elites have tried to play on these sorts of fears. They tend to be leaders in political parties that are more on the fringes of the party system. So most of the mainstream large political parties that are center-left or center-right think the EU is a good thing. They're not opposed to European integration. They don't take positions that are opposed to European integration. In fact, there's very little competition in the center. So center-right and center-left parties in most European countries are agreed. And it doesn't matter who's in government, they tend to pursue the same policies with regard to the EU. So when we see these elites emerge, they tend to be parties that maybe don't hold any elected office, or maybe they only hold a few seats in their parliament. They don't get as much attention from the media. That's what they're trying to do with this strategy, is to mobilize greater media attention and greater public support. And they tend to be a little bit more extreme in whatever their positions are. And you know, that there's been a lot of research devoted to them, just because, at least within the European Parliament, not so much at the national level, but within the European Parliament, these groups have gained some influence over the last 10 years. So that's the end of the presentation as I have it. It is a really cursory overview of what we mean by the democracy deficit within the EU, and the different components of that, and how public opinion works. We're at 5 now, but I'm more than happy to take any questions if anyone has them. Yeah, the presentation has been recorded, and it will be posted on the European Union Center of Excellence website here at IU, or if you, I'm going to type this in, if you actually do Google search for WEST, which is the West European Studies program and department at IU in Indiana, the website for WEST will come up, and the recording to see yourself recorded. Knowledge, which is something that I've done a lot of work on, and I think is really interesting. And obviously, if you have this idea of an active citizenry, and that's necessary for democracy, you want those citizens to also be knowledgeable in how politics works, and that does sort of play into the whole discussion of transparency. And the question then is, do Europeans really know anything about the EU? And a lot of people for a very long time have assumed that they don't, that Europeans don't care about the EU, that they don't follow it, they don't pay attention, don't know much at all about it. And it's really interesting because we know, based on survey research done in America, that most Americans don't know anything about American politics. And actually, Europeans don't know that much about their own national politics. So political knowledge in general is something that's not in large supply. So you begin with that, and you bring in this whole transparency discussion and say, well, people already don't follow politics that closely. And then you introduce this thing called the European Union, which is very large, very complex, and very distant. So we would expect them not to know anything, or to know even less, actually, about the EU than they do their national political systems, right? We're able to measure this because a lot of surveys now include true-false questions that tap knowledge about politics. And there's a recent survey called the European Election Study that includes a set of questions, true-false. So it's not the most stringent test of knowledge, but it is a test of knowledge. A set of true-false questions about the history and institutions of the EU, and a set of questions about the history and institutions of their national government, whichever that may be. And what I find, just to begin with, is that it's the same. People know in the past, and assumptions that Europeans don't know anything. They know at least as much as they do about national politics. That might not be enough. You know, it's not saying that they can still act as this sort of ideal informed citizenry. But this point Moravchik makes, which is that many of these problems are typical at the national system, the data certainly at least provides some support for that. Okay, if there's no further questions, again, I've provided my email address. I'm happy to provide these PowerPoint slides to anyone that wants them, or to answer any additional questions. So I look forward to hearing from any of you that are interested in that. And thank you again for logging in today and participating in this webinar. I'm going to do a third webinar next Tuesday, which is on agricultural policy in the EU, that looks at the origins and evolution of ag policy. So if you're interested in continuing to talk about the EU, or if you come from an agricultural community at all, I certainly encourage you to come back for that. Excuse me. But if there are no further questions, I'll go ahead and end this. So I'd look forward to seeing you, Polly. Okay. So thank you very much.